Um, well, we saw that for Bentham, utilitarianism is a matter of balancing out pleasures and pains. He adopts hedonism, the standard that pleasure alone is worth pursuing for its own sake, or happiness. He uses these terms interchangeably. But this claim of his, of Bentham's, that all pleasures are on a par as long as they're equal, got him into some trouble. People criticize his moral philosophy as giving us a very low view of human beings, as giving us a view of human beings that doesn't draw a distinction between us and non-human animals. Because basically what he's saying in saying that quantity of pleasure being the same, pushpins as good as poetry, a child's game like pickup sticks is as good as something sophisticated like reading poetry if you get as much pleasure from it. When I came in, my earlier class was, bettering themselves intellectually by watching some of the Maury Povich show on cable. And I sarcastically said, well, at least you guys aren't watching one of those shows that caters to the least common denominator in human nature. But the point is, if you get as much pleasure out of, watching Maury Povich and people arguing over the custody of children and slapping one another and what have you, as you do from listening to a symphony or reading Maya Angelou's poetry or something like this, for Bentham, they're all on a par. So people criticized Bentham on this, said, look, you're saying there's no distinction between us as human beings and the pig out there in the field eating slop. And I didn't make this up with the pig. He was criticized literally for giving us a pig morality. For saying, you've got a moral philosophy that doesn't distinguish between us and the pig out there in the field. If the pig gets as much pleasure from eating slop out there in the field as we do from reading Maya Angelou's poetry, then it's all equal to Bentham. So Mill tried to respond to this criticism, but by now Bentham is getting pretty old and, kind of too old to really respond well in the marketplace of ideas to criticisms of utilitarianism. So his young pupil, John Stuart Mill, sort of takes up the mantle of defending utilitarianism against his critics. And he tries to do this by saying that, look, there are some pleasures that human beings know and are capable of appreciating that the pig out there in the field has no knowledge of. And so he tries to draw a distinction between higher and lower pleasures and says, yes, utilitarianism really can account for a distinction between us as human beings and the pig out there in the field. I mean, I have a friend who also likes shows with the lowest common denominator, or that cater to the lowest common denominator. I mean, she's just hooked on these Real Housewives of X shows. It doesn't matter where X is, whether it's the Real Housewives of Atlanta or Beverly Hills or wherever. She's in. She's all in. She loves watching that stuff. I've occasionally watched some with her, but I don't get excited by the Real Housewives of X. But one of the things you learn is that here are women with all huge, beautiful homes, classic families, and yet they still have a lot of problems. Having wealth doesn't insulate you from having problems. Might help you to deal with them a little bit better. So we all have our problems. Now, suppose somebody came up to you and said, well, you know what, I've been dabbling a lot with magic. And I think I've learned enough that I could turn you into a pig. And I can promise you, you will be a very happy pig. And you can forget some of these problems that are plaguing you right now. Now, which one of us would take that deal? Probably no one. Why? Because you know that there are things you can appreciate as a human being and that give meaning to your life, that give pleasure to your existence, that the pig out there in the field knows nothing of. And Mill recognized this. He says, which one of us would trade places with the beast out there in the field, even if we were promised, the way he said it in 19th century flowery language, which one of us would trade places with the pig out there in the field for the fullest allowance of a beast's pleasures? In other words, if somebody said, you're going to have as many pleasures as a pig can have, which one of us is going to take that deal? So Mill says, we wouldn't trade places. And he says one of the reasons is there are pleasures, and he calls them higher quality pleasures. So remember, the word to keep in mind when you're thinking of Bentham's view of utilitarianism is quantity of pleasure. But for Mill, he thinks that he can respond to these criticisms of utilitarianism by introducing qualitative distinctions and saying, well, there are higher quality pleasures that humans can appreciate and the pig out there in the field doesn't. So utilitarianism really isn't a philosophy that caters just to the lowest common denominator or that has a low view of human nature. So he said uniquely human pleasures, like the pleasures that come from art and imagination, music, poetry. He says these are higher quality pleasures, and they're more desirable even if the quantity of pleasure is lower. And one of his famous quotes is, it's better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool or a pig satisfied. In other words, it's better to have a lower quantity of pleasure from a higher quality pleasure, like the pleasure of discussing philosophical ideas with people like Socrates had, than to be a fool or somebody just satisfied with the pleasures of appetite or the pig out there in the field. Now, the point is, and again, this page is from an earlier edition of Solomon, so it might be slightly different in your newest edition. That, by the way, really is a picture of an ancient Greek statue of Socrates. So that's probably how he really looked. It's like the real deal. But at any rate, what later people have observed is this move by Mill, where he's trying to defend hedonism, actually ends up in reality abandoning it. Because what does hedonism say? It says that there's only one thing, call it happiness or pleasure, that is worth seeking for its own sake alone. Any other things that are worthwhile are only worthwhile insofar as they promote happiness or pleasure or lessen unhappiness or pain, but not in themselves. But when Mill says that it's better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool or a pig satisfied, well, you say, well, wait a second. What makes a higher pleasure, like reading poetry or discussing philosophy or attending the symphony, what makes it higher in quality and more desirable? Well, it can't be just pleasure alone, because if Socrates is dissatisfied, he's got less pleasure. So, whatever makes these so-called higher pleasures higher and more valuable, it's something other than just mere pleasure. And if that's the case, then you're introducing other standards and you're saying that other things are worthwhile besides just pleasure itself. And by the way, how do we tell a higher from a lower pleasure? Well, Mill says you don't ask the pig out there in the field because he knows only one side of the issue, right? Pig just knows how it is. But he says, how do you tell? Well, you ask somebody who's experienced both if you're trying to compare two pleasures, and they'll tell you which one is higher. They'll have a preference for the higher pleasure. At least this is Mill's claim. None of us would want to trade places with a pig out there in the field. That might be true. But do we always have an automatic preference for the kinds of things Mill would consider the higher pleasures? I like to relate this story. I once dragged a friend of mine down. I haven't done much guitar playing lately, but I don't play classical guitar, but I can appreciate, really well-played guitar music. And I saw this ad where there was going to be a classical guitar duo playing on, it was a Friday or Saturday night. I think it was a Friday night, down at the Walters Art Gallery. I don't know if there still is there. This was in the 1990s, but there was a little theater in the basement of the Walters Art Gallery, right? So here, I dragged this person I was dating at the time along, and she's fighting sleep because she taught school and had been up since 5 o'clock in the morning. And so there's about 300 or 400 of us in this little theater listening to this classical guitar duo. Well, why bring this up? Well, obviously, this would be the kind of thing Mill would have considered a higher quality pleasure, right? But just down the road from where we were, and those of you from out of town, the Walters Art Gallery is downtown, but the Civic Center, the Civic Arena, is not that far from it, maybe a mile or less away. That same night, the WWF, the World Wrestling Federation, was having, I think it was Super Slam 6, right, wrestling down there at the Civic Center. You know what? I think there were probably a few more people down there at the Civic Center watching wrestling than there were listening to classical guitar music that night. And what's more, and this is what relates to Mill's point, I think some of those people who were watching wrestling that night knew very well what classical guitar music sounded like. And yet they did not vote with their feet for the kind of things that Mill would have considered to be the higher pleasure. So Mill's test for how you sort them out doesn't seem to work in real life. But contemporary utilitarians adopt a pluralistic standard. In other words, they would say, they basically give up hedonism to say, well, yes, pleasure is a good, happiness is a good in itself, just like the hedonists claim, but there are other things that are good just for their own sake and not because they promote pleasure. Things like knowledge, self-realization, the satisfaction of our preferences, all are viewed by contemporary utilitarians as having intrinsic worth. So most contemporary utilitarians then overtly abandon hedonism, and they deny the hedonist claim that pleasure or happiness is the only standard. So in making this distinction between higher and lower pleasures, if it's not pleasure that makes the higher pleasures higher, then there's some other thing that makes them worthwhile. And if you claim that, then you're saying there are other things besides pleasure that are intrinsically good. And this is where a lot of contemporary hedonists go. Now, a notable exception is the person you saw in the video, Peter Singer. He's kind of an old-style, hedonistic Benthamite utilitarian. And he's also a rabid animal rights activist. Now, Bentham thought we had direct duties to non-human animals. And he said, you want to find out whether we have direct moral duties to non-human animals? Here's the question you ought to ask. The thing that's important when we're considering non-human animals is not can they reason. Note we saw Aristotle and Aquinas thought we could draw a sharp line at reasoning between human beings and non-human animals, and we'll see that Immanuel Kant did too. But Bentham says the question asked is not can the animals reason, and it's not can they talk. Some people have said what separates us from non-human animals like the dolphins and the primates is that we're language users, they're not. Not in the complicated way that we use language. They may communicate. So it's louder than you think, folks. At any rate, but Bentham says, no, the question asked is not can they reason or can they talk, but can they suffer? Can they feel pain and pleasure? And if so, then he says we have direct duties to non-human animals. And Peter Singer, in this camp, has been a rabid animal rights activist. Now, we mentioned that there are problems with making pain and pleasure the standard. And one real problem is determining what's to count as a unit of pain or pleasure. And we saw that it's practically impossible because pains and pleasures are subjective and they're not open to public observation, practically impossible to settle on a standard everybody would agree on as to what would count as a unit of pleasure, one hedon, or a unit of pain minus one hedon. However, more contemporary utilitarian reasoning has used different units of measure where we do know what they are. We might not know what counts as one hedon's worth of pleasure, but we do know what counts as $1, right? And so contemporary utilitarian reason very often combines the accounting technique of a cost-benefit analysis with moral presuppositions. So it uses a readily countable unit like dollars. It views the morally right or the morally good course of action as what gives us the most bang for the buck, as what produces the most economic benefits versus costs for all concerned. And then it avoids the problem of standardizing on a countable unit. And so a lot of policies are now made using a cost-benefit analysis. And in a single-payer healthcare system like the British system, that's how care is going to be meted out. That's how care is meted out. Now, I have a friend, as I said, whose mother is going to be 88 come Halloween. Her birthday's on Halloween. And she fell and broke her hip recently. And now Medicare, will pay for a medical procedure like an operation, and really it's a life-saving operation for somebody of that age, because they die of things like a broken hip. And Medicare paid for the procedure of having her operated on, and Medicare will pay for something just because you need it to save your life, figuring that a human life, we can't just put a dollar value on it. However, in a single-payer system like the British system, deciding whether or not you get that procedure is made using cost-benefit analysis. In the British system, they use what they call quality-adjusted QALY, quality-adjusted life years. In other words, if we as a society spend the money to give you that operation, say $100,000 or what it's going to cost, are we going to get enough bang for the buck in terms of the number of quality years you're going to have left after the surgery? And if the answer is no, then like Barack Obama told the guy who asked him about his 100-year-old mother, the question is, well, Barack Obama said, well, some people, it doesn't matter if she has a zest for life. She's 100. Some people we just want to give a pain pill to and say, bye-bye, see ya. Ezekiel Emanuel, a doctor who was Rahm Emanuel's brother, who's now mayor of Chicago, but was in the White House, right, chief of staff. He wants, instead of the British system, what he calls a system where we would just talk about the years people have lived. And under his system, if you're over 75, you're deemed as living a whole life. And so we as a society don't owe you anything more. That's now, I don't know if that's the system that's going to be implemented, but we're going in the direction of having these things figured out via a cost-benefit analysis, with Obamacare. So this is utilitarian reasoning because it weighs what it considers to be the good against the costs, and it recommends action on the side of what produces the most benefits for the least cost to society as a whole. And of course, in a single-payer healthcare system, which we do not have, but there are people who want to go there, the cost of your treatment is the cost to society because the government is a single payer. Well, one of the things that I mentioned at the beginning that the utilitarians were trying to do is to introduce a way to reason about moral right and wrong again in the wake of David Hume's skepticism about moral reasoning in general. For Hume, morality is more a matter of sentiment than reason. And Hume basically says, look, take a moral statement like stealing is morally wrong. He says, the statements that comprise human knowledge are of two kinds. They're either true by mere operation of thought, by the way they're constructed, like mathematical truths and truths in geography. Now, take a statement like stealing is morally wrong. If it's true, is it true in the same way that 2 plus 2 equals 4 is true? Well, no. So it doesn't fit into that category. Well, Hume says the other kinds of statements that comprise human knowledge are the ones based on observations about the world. Right? Scientific observation. But Hume says, take a statement like murder is vicious. He says, consider that action in your mind, turn it over on all sides, mull it over, and try to find that quality that we call moral viciousness that murder has. And Hume says you can't do it. So he says statements like stealing is morally wrong, murder is vicious, they're not part of our knowledge based on, tracing things back to an observation. You can't find the observation that confirms a statement like murder is vicious. So Hume says, well, what do you find? Well, if I say murder is vicious or stealing is morally wrong, what you find is that I have strong feelings against those actions. If I say it's really good to give to help the poor, I have strong positive feelings. So Hume says, look, morality is just a matter of personal feelings. It has nothing to do with reasoning. So part of what Bentham and Mill are trying to do is to introduce a way that we can reason about moral matters again. And they think we can avoid some of Hume's criticisms if we make reasoning about morality not a matter of knowing the abstract will of God or a matter that goes beyond the senses to abstract moral principles built into the foundation of the universe. But if we can make reasoning about morality, if we can take it out of the transcendent and otherworldly, and instead of saying it's a matter of following God's will or abstract moral principles, if we can get it down to earth, we can reason about moral right and wrong again. And so Bentham and Mill's attempt here is to try to get morality down to earth. We may not know what some of these ethereal, otherworldly things are, but we know what it is for humans to suffer pain and pleasure in the world that you and I actually live in. And so let's make morality a matter of promoting the greatest happiness for the greatest number in society, or of lessening pain. And so we get morality down to earth. Morality becomes, for utilitarianism, a matter of promoting pleasure or happiness, or lessening pain or unhappiness for real people in this world, and for Bentham, for animals as well. In other words, part of the thing to take into account for Bentham is the suffering of the animals that will be displaced by building the Bakun Dam in that video we saw. Now, so utilitarians would say a great advantage of their moral view is that it allows us, by getting it morality down to the concrete areas that you and I live in, enables us to reason about moral right and wrong again. And it also enables us to take what some philosophers, even non-utilitarians, have called the moral point of view. That is the point of view where we stand back from a situation and make a moral decision as if it didn't even affect us. Where we say, look, I just want to do the right thing here, and the right thing may not be the thing that where I come out the best. But I just want to make the decision, you know, as if I were an objective observer who didn't have a dog in the fight, so to speak, even if it really does affect you. And utilitarianism, by saying that we ought to be promoting the greatest good for the greatest number, allows us to do this. Because promoting the greatest good for the greatest number may not be what works out the best for me. But it may be the right thing to do. So, another strength of utilitarianism is that it's practical. It actually works to figure out things in the real world. And it's straightforward and objective. But this idea that it's realistic, they would count it as a strength. It recognizes that very often we have to balance off the interests of the many against the interests of the few, and sometimes overriding the interests of the few. In other words, it's consistent with saying that the greatest good for the greatest number was promoted, that some segment of a population affected by the moral decision does not fare well at all. And a good example is what happened right across the street, right? Somebody may say, well, look, for the whole community of Baltimore, for the greatest good for the greatest number, it's best that a university like this grow and that we have space to expand and, you know, attract new students, put a new science building in there. However, I think it's safe to suppose that some of the people who were forced to move from their homes when we leveled a whole square block didn't want to go. Maybe they were compensated in a way that they figure wasn't even fair compensation. I don't know. But we're balancing off the interests of the many against the interests of the few, and we're overriding the interests of the few. And utilitarianism can justify doing this. But for some people, that's actually an objection. Well, one objection is that it's deceptively simple. Remember, we said utilitarianism is based on just one main principle. Promote the greatest good for the greatest number. Whether you define that good in terms of happiness or a plural standard. But in reality, pardon?
I guess everybody at this time were atheist. Well, no one was atheist at this time. Everyone had that God thing.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite.
I said, I'm guessing around like this age, like this time,
Mm-hmm.
in the world, no one was atheist. Everybody had that God that they praised or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, and the thing is, the utilitarians, remember, these guys are writing in 19th century England where it's self-consciously a Christian nation. There's the Church of England, right? And one of the things that both Bentham and Mill tried to do in their writings is to say, look, we're developing a moral theory that will enable us to reason about moral right and wrong without bringing theological considerations into the mix. But they do try to say we're trying not to be anti-religious in our theory, but it's just that, I mean, this has become a main theory for secular moralists today, because you can use it without bringing theological assumptions in. But it's arguable that sometimes the conclusions of utilitarian reasoning may not sync very well with where somebody who has a more conservative, say, divine command morality or natural law morality, where they would be coming from.
Okay, you're speaking on morality and morals and everything. What I was basically saying is no one was an atheist, so everyone back then had some type of God that they praised, right?
Most people in that society would have been, yeah.
With the views that you're teaching us and that you're showing us, with the different religions, is the same in each religion? Like you have the Buddhists, the Christians, and I don't know everybody else. Other religions, were the same for every different religion?
Well, I mean, you can certainly ask about that, and whether now utilitarianism does claim to give us the universal truth about morality, and that is that we ought to act so as to produce, in terms of results, the greatest good for the greatest number. And so they're saying that that applies in Baltimore City, but it also applies in the rainforests of Borneo, where, in other words, they think we're talking about universal moral truths. Now, you can challenge that assumption. But I mean, one of the things that people point out against cultural relativism in morality is that while there are differences, there are some virtually universally accepted moral principles. I mean, almost no society condones incest, you know, in nuclear families. We're leaving West Virginia out of the mixture here. But, you know, West Virginia aside, unless I can criticize West Virginia. When my relatives first came here from Eastern Europe, they settled worked the coal mines in West Virginia, you know. So my relatives came from West Virginia at one time. At any rate, no, they're famous for but the point is, I had an ethics text that had quotations from just about every major scripture of every religion and they all had some version of the golden rule, you know, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. You know, so one criticism of cultural relativism is to say, well, yes, while there are differences, there are some core values that virtually every religion accepts, and you know, and most every culture, you know.
So basically, what you're explaining to me is that for views like this, it's pretty much they're talking about the same thing, but they're wording it differently.
Well, yeah. One of the things he might say is, you may reach the same conclusions about what it's morally right to do, but you'll do it for different reasons. In other words, if you say, if you know, you can develop a moral argument against stealing from utilitarian principles, you could also look at one of the 10 Commandments, thou shalt not steal. And he might say, well, in the end, you're both concluding that stealing is wrong, but for different reasons, you know. But he's saying, I'm giving you a way of working that out morally that doesn't raise the issues that, say, a divine command morality would raise about whether or not God exists and whether or not we could know the will of God, and what about, you know, how do we know that the scriptures are you know, have verity and are dependable and legitimate, you know. All those are issues that have been discussed, and that Christian apologists have provided reasons for. But Mill and Bentham are trying to get out a way of reasoning about moral issues that sort of sets some of these controversial issues about morality on the side. You know, so I don't know if that answers your question, but however, we still have about 6 or 7 minutes. Utilitarianism can be complicated for several reasons. One is, how do we predict consequences, and can we always do this accurately? Remember that example about taking your nephew to the circus. Well, what if we try to predict that the nephew is going to enjoy the circus and we find that he hates the circus? You know, you don't always get it right. I learned that Uncle Vic, there was a stage at which Uncle Vic needed to start giving cards with money in it at Christmas, or gift cards, because Uncle Vic's choices of presents as the kids got, as my niece and nephews got older, weren't always very good. You know, it's hard to predict sometimes what people will enjoy. And so, you know, one of the criticisms of utilitarianism is that it's hard to predict future consequences. And take a major project. I mean, look at all the problems that Obamacare is having now. What is it, $634 million to develop a huge computer website that doesn't work, you know, and that's signing up people by the dozens when it needs to be signing up people by the thousands and tens of thousands. You know, look at the big dig in Boston, this big transportation project that was 10 times over budget. Cost 10 times more than the original expectations because of all the problems they ran into. Sometimes it's very hard to predict future consequences, and yet utilitarianism says you need to make moral decisions today based on what you project as future consequences. And it's also hard to predict others' pains and pleasures. You know, how do we know what other people are going to like or not like? So that's a problem with utilitarianism. And also, obviously, pains and pleasures are private mental states. It's kind of hard to predict that. Plus, sometimes we have to compare very diverse types of goods. How do I balance off? Suppose I hate my part-time job, but I know that if I work an extra 10 hours a week at my part-time job, I might be able to have the pleasure of buying a new flat screen for next fall's football season. Well, how do I balance those two off? You know, the pain and unpleasantness of working extra hours at a job I hate versus the extra pleasure that I'll get from a new flat screen. You know, now I'm going to skip this first one. We're just not going to worry about this. But sometimes, I mean, as with eminent domain, utilitarianism can justify overriding people's basic rights, like their property rights, for what is called the common good or the greater good, right? But, you know, sometimes people wonder, well, how far are we going to go with this? Would a terminally ill patient be forced to opt for euthanasia because it says, well, you know, it's going to cost society too much to keep you alive for the next year, so why don't you just do the right thing and opt for euthanasia? This is one of the arguments against legalizing it, that there might be a slippery slope. First it's permitted, and then, you know, people are pressured to opt for that. You know, so it could even challenge a person's right to life, or with health care decisions made on utilitarian reasoning. But now, we only have a minute or two, but to get back to the idea, they said this is not an anti-religious thing, but if the good consequences outweigh the bad consequences, Richard Taylor, for instance, says if having love affairs gives you, on balance, more pleasure than the opposite, then you're morally justified in having love affairs. Or you can say, well, what about you know, the pain it would cause in your spouse if she found out? And he says, well, that's all right, because utilitarianism would morally justify you in lying to her about the love affair to spare her that pain and suffering. And some of us say, well, if it justifies things like that, there's a problem with utilitarian reasoning. You know, can it justify committing adultery or breaking a promise? If I promised somebody on his deathbed to give $50,000 to his profligate nephew, and I deem that he's going to waste the money, but more good than bad results will be produced if I take that money and instead donate it to a children's hospital, well, utilitarian reasoning would justify my breaking that promise to the dying man to give the money to his nephew, and justify me breaking that promise and giving it to the children's hospital. But after all, it was his money to do with as he chose, and he chose that that money would go to his nephew. Am I right in breaking that promise I made to him? Well, I mean, utilitarianism can justify that, and we already saw it can justify violating people's basic rights, like property rights, even their right to life, in certain circumstances. So it's a controversial moral theory, and while it's not claimed to be anti-religious, sometimes utilitarian reasoning can come out in a very different place than, say, a devout evangelical Christian would come out on the same issue. So, at any rate, we're going to look at Kant next time, you know, I'm not going to get into some of the subtleties past this point. There are some additional slides that I used to use in a separate ethics course. If anybody missed the roll, try to sign it. Sorry, it got a little wet there. And see you Monday.